Okay, so have you ever heard that quote, whoever controls the issuance of money in a nation controls the nation? Pretty intense, right?
Yeah, it really makes you think.
It's attributed to Mayer Rothschild, and it's a perfect intro to what we're diving into today.
Definitely sets the stage. We're going deep into this whole concept of financial warfare.
Yeah, we're going way beyond the surface level stuff. You know, our listeners are smart. They really want to understand the hidden machinery of global finance, the how it all really works part.
Yeah, they want those aha moments, those sudden realizations of how things connect.
Exactly. And that's what we're hoping to deliver in this deep dive.
So to get us there, our main source today is a document called Currency Wars in Chinese.
Hmm.
It's Shou.
And this document dives into major financial events going all the way back to the 18th century.
Yeah, it tries to lay out the strategies and tactics behind these events, especially how they might relate to China.
Right. And it's important to remember that this document is coming from a specific perspective, a specific interpretation of history.
Totally. Our goal here isn't to say whether everything in this document is right or wrong.
No, we're not fact-checking. We're trying to unpack the main arguments and how this source sees history.
Right. We want you, the listener, to grasp the narrative being presented, who the key players are, what institutions are involved, and how they all might be connected according to this source.
Okay, so let's get started and jump right into one of the first big names that pops up, the Rothschild family.
Right. The Rothschilds.
Yeah, the book describes them as this super rich family whose wealth and influence kind of operate under the radar.
Hidden power.
It even contrasts them with someone like Bill Gates, who's so publicly known. And it makes this pretty big claim right away.
Yeah.
They control major Western media.
That's a huge statement. The book is establishing this idea of immense power working quietly behind the scenes. And that media control piece is a key part of the argument. It's suggesting there's a way to shape what the public sees and believes. So if they really control all this media, then we can ask what evidence is there and how would this control actually work?
Exactly. Now the source traces the Rothschild family's rise to power back to Mayer Rothschild and his 5 sons. They strategically set up banking operations all across Europe.
Smart move.
Yeah.
Having branches all over Europe let them work across different economies and governments. This early global approach was like the foundation for their future power.
Yeah. And then there's the famous story about the Waterloo deception. The book says that Nathan Rothschild got news of the British victory way before anyone else.
Early intel.
He used that info to buy up a ton of British government bonds.
At a discount, presumably.
And this is supposed to be how he made a massive fortune. The book claims he gained control of the Bank of England and British national debt, even has Nathan saying, "I don't care who sits on the throne as long as I control the money supply." Which brings us back to that opening quote.
It's like that quote in action. This Waterloo story is central to the whole Rothschild legend. It shows how using information quickly in financial markets can have big consequences. And that quote from Nathan perfectly sums up the idea that controlling money is more powerful than holding political office. This is one of the first big examples the book gives of financial maneuvering, shaping politics and the economy.
Wow. Okay, so then the book dives into national debt. It says that debt actually helps private banks because governments keep borrowing money and paying interest on those loans using taxes from you and me.
It's like a built-in revenue stream for the banks. The source even gives a crazy statistic. British national debt went from £1.25 million in 1694 to over £5 trillion by the end of 2005. That's like 43% of the UK's GDP.
A huge increase. So this massive growth in national debt is presented as evidence of this system working for the banks over centuries.
Yeah, the book is arguing that the whole structure of national debt benefits private lending institutions. Governments issue bonds to get money, and private banks buy and sell these bonds and collect the interest payments, which are ultimately paid for by the public through taxes.
Okay, makes sense. Now, the source brings up the City of London. It's this tiny area, only like 2.6 square kilometers, but it has its own laws and courts, almost like a nation within a nation.
A state within a state.
And the book emphasizes that the City of London is this huge global financial center. It generates a ton of money for the UK. It's positioned as another key part of this system of financial control.
Yeah, what's interesting is that the book focuses on how the City of London has its own legal and operational structure. It's separate from the rest of the UK, which kind of reinforces the idea that these financial entities have their own sphere of influence, potentially operating with some level of independence.
Right. It's its own thing. Okay, so back to Nathan Rothschild. The book talks about his early business activities. He was allegedly involved in smuggling goods during the Napoleonic Wars, and he was connected to important people in the British Treasury.
Well, those connections probably gave him valuable insights into what the British military was doing.
Exactly. The source paints him as this really savvy operator who understood how finance, politics, and even war all connected.
Yeah, not just a banker, but a guy pulling strings.
And then there's this story about him basically going head-to-head with the Bank of England. The book says that Nathan went to the Bank of England and demanded gold in exchange for their banknotes.
A power move.
It caused a run on the bank. People panicked and wanted their gold, and the Bank of England was forced to give in and accept Nathan's bank's notes. This is a pretty dramatic example of how much financial power he supposedly had.
That's the source's point.
Yeah.
Nathan Rothschild was so powerful that he could pressure even the Central Bank of England. It really shows how dominant the Rothschild family had become in the world of finance.
Now let's shift gears and look at the U.S., specifically the struggle to establish a central bank in the United States. And this is where things take a dark turn. The source says there was this long and dangerous fight over creating a private central banking system in the U.S.
A fight with high stakes.
It claims that 7 U.S. presidents were assassinated and a bunch of congressmen died because of this conflict. It even says the death rate was higher than for the soldiers who landed at Normandy during World War II.
That's a bold claim for sure. It needs to be carefully examined and compared with what other historical accounts say. The comparison to Normandy is meant to emphasize how dangerous it supposedly was to oppose this private central bank.
Yeah, it's a very strong statement. Then the source focuses on Abraham Lincoln's assassination, suggesting it was connected to his opposition to these international bankers.
Ah, so Lincoln is framed as a victim in this financial power struggle.
Right. Remember, Lincoln issued the greenbacks during the Civil War. This was a way for the U.S. government to print its own money without borrowing from private banks.
So the source sees this as Lincoln directly challenging the international bankers. They didn't want him controlling the money supply.
And to make things even more suspicious, the book brings up a claim that John Wilkes Booth, the guy who shot Lincoln, was linked to European financial circles.
So the implication is that powerful financial interests were behind Lincoln's assassination.
Exactly. Next, the source talks about Andrew Jackson, another president who fiercely opposed the central bank. He actually succeeded in paying off the U.S. national debt in 1835.
Wow, that's a big deal.
And the book makes it seem like this was a major setback for the bankers.
Of course, if they're profiting off the debt, they don't want it gone.
Right. And then someone tried to assassinate Jackson, too. The book even quotes his supposed last words, "I killed the bank."
Like a final blow.
Yeah, he's painted as this hero who fought against financial control. But after Jackson shut down the second bank of the U.S. in 1836, the source claims these international bankers caused a 5-year economic crisis. They supposedly pulled all the metal coins out of circulation.
So the book is saying this crisis was deliberately caused to punish the U.S. for rejecting the central bank.
Right. But then the book contrasts this with the discovery of gold in California in 1848 and Australia in 1851.
The gold rush.
Exactly. Those gold discoveries supposedly helped the U.S. economy recover because it increased the money supply outside of the bankers' control.
So the book is drawing a direct line between closing the central bank and the economic downturn, blaming the international bankers for intentionally causing it.
Okay, now on to the U.S. Civil War. The source makes a really interesting argument. It says the Civil War was mainly about economic interests.
Economic interest related to the banking system.
Yes. It downplays the whole slavery issue and puts the focus on who would control the U.S. financial system.
That's a bold reinterpretation of the Civil War. Most people see slavery as the central cause, but this source is putting economics front and center.
Right. And here's something you might not have heard before. The book claims that Russia actually sent its navy to New York and San Francisco in 1863.
To support the North.
Yep. It's supposed to have stopped Britain and France from joining the war on the side of the Confederacy.
That's a fascinating detail that you don't hear about very often.
And the book goes on to say that the U.S. bought Alaska from Russia later on to basically repay them for this help.
Huh. So Alaska was like a thank you gift? Interesting. So the book is framing Russia as a strategic player in the Civil War, maybe even suggesting that they had financial motivations for supporting the Union.
Okay, now let's fast forward to the creation of the Federal Reserve.
The Fed.
Yeah. The source talks about this super secret meeting on Jekyll Island back in 1910.
Okay, this is getting juicy.
Right. It names all these important figures who were supposedly there. Piet Andrew, Frank Vanderlip, Henry Davison, Charles Norton, Benjamin Strong, and most importantly, Paul Warburg.
Paul Warburg. He was a big advocate for central banking in the U.S., right?
Yes. And the book emphasizes his connection to the Rothschilds in Europe. This Jekyll Island meeting is presented as the moment when the Federal Reserve Act was conceived.
So it's like the birthplace of the Fed, according to this source. Now, the Jekyll Island meeting did happen. That's historical fact. But the exact details and what everyone's intentions were are still debated. The source highlights Paul Warburg and his European banking connections, which ties back into the idea of international influence over the U.S. financial system.
Exactly. The book goes on to say that the Federal Reserve was purposely designed to be a privately owned central bank, one that would make a lot of money for its owners.
Privately owned, but controlling the nation's money.
And it highlights how the government's 20% stake was removed compared to earlier central banking models, suggesting this was done to give private interests more control.
So the source is emphasizing the private ownership aspect of the Fed and how it could potentially generate profits for its shareholders.
Right. And here's a clever point the book makes. It claims the name Federal Reserve System was chosen to trick people, to make them think it was a government institution when it's really controlled by private banks.
Ah, a deliberate misdirection.
Yeah. The book even includes a quote that says, although Congress technically has oversight, the majority of the Federal Reserve Board is controlled directly or indirectly by banking associations.
So the book is saying the name Federal Reserve is misleading. It creates the illusion of government control when in reality, private banking interests hold the power.
Exactly. To further its argument, the book introduces George Peabody and J.P. Morgan. Peabody was really successful with U.S. bonds early on, but he didn't have any children to inherit his fortune. So he partnered with Junius Morgan, which eventually led to the creation of J.P. Morgan & Co., one of the most powerful banks in the world.
Setting the stage for the Morgan dynasty.
The source even mentions a supposed meeting between J.P. Morgan and the Rothschilds in 1869, connecting these major financial families.
Drawing a line between the American and European financial elite.
Right. Then there's Jacob Schiff and the firm Kuhn-Loeb. The book portrays Schiff as a top agent for the Rothschilds in the U.S. He joined Kuhn-Loeb in 1875, and the firm became super influential in American finance.
Another key player in the alleged international network.
And the book puts a lot of emphasis on Paul Warburg. It says he was the mastermind behind establishing a private central bank in the U.S. He was building on the work of people like Jacob Schiff.
So Warburg is like the architect of the Fed in this narrative.
Yeah. The book even quotes a guy named Garrison who advised Presidents Roosevelt and Wilson on financial matters. Garrison apparently said that Warburg took the old Aldrich plan, which failed to create a central bank, and reworked it into the Federal Reserve Act.
Wow, so he's taking existing ideas and making them work.
And to really hammer home the point about private control, the source provides what it claims is shareholding data for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York from May 1914.
Hard numbers.
It lists the major shareholders like a National City Bank of New York, which it says was controlled by Rockefeller, and Kuhn-Loeb J.P. Morgan's First National Bank, Paul Warburg's National Bank of Commerce, and Hanover Bank, which supposedly had Rothschild connections.
The who's who of finance.
And then it points out that National City Bank and First National Bank later merged to form Citibank.
So even more concentrated power.
This is presented as clear evidence of private control over the Fed. And to further criticize the system, the book says the Federal Reserve just issues paper backed by paper.
Meaning it's not backed by anything tangible like gold.
Right. Which the source uses to suggest that the Fed's monetary system is inherently unstable. Its value depends entirely on trust in the government, not on any real asset.
It's a common argument against fiat currency.
The book then mentions a 1978 Senate report that apparently showed how major banks had a huge network of directorships in top U.S. companies. It gives examples of how many director positions were held by banks like Citibank, J.P. Morgan, and Hanover Bank. The book suggests that this gave them a lot of influence over businesses beyond just banking.
So it's not just about controlling the money, it's about controlling the whole economy.
Right. And the source provides specific examples of who owned the most shares in those New York banks back in 1914, reinforcing the idea that a small group of people had a huge amount of control.
Concentrated power.
Finally, the book talks about the Federal Advisory Council. It's made up of representatives from the 12 Federal Reserve districts. But the source is skeptical about this council. It questions whether bankers really act in the public's best interest. It suggests the council mainly benefits the banking industry itself.
Right, because if it's bankers advising the Fed, it raises the question of whose interests are really being served.
Okay, so now we move into a section called Financial Crises and Manipulation.
Oh, this sounds ominous.
It is. The source argues that not having a central bank before the Federal Reserve actually prevented deliberate economic crises. Because without a central authority controlling the money supply, it was harder to create large-scale crises on purpose.
It's a counterintuitive argument. We usually think of central banks as preventing crises. But the source is saying that without a central point of control, there was less opportunity for manipulation.
And then it discusses World War I. The book includes a quote from Henry Kissinger where he expresses surprise that the war even started. The book then directly links this to the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, suggesting the Fed made it possible to finance the war.
So the Fed is framed as a tool that made it easier to fund a massive war effort,
It even mentions that Paul Warburg might have been sympathetic to Germany.
really adding to the intrigue.
After the war, the book briefly talks about the Treaty of Versailles. It calls it a harsh settlement that was forced on Germany. It kind of implies that this harshness created problems later on.
Like setting the stage for future instability.
Then we get to the Wall Street crash of 1929. The source claims there was another secret meeting, this time, of central bankers back in 1927. After that meeting, the New York Fed lowered interest rates, and the source says this caused a huge stock market bubble. It uses the analogy of shearing the wool, implying that insiders made a ton of money by betting against the market right before it crashed.
That's pretty ruthless.
It even says that Henry Morgenthau, who was the Treasury Secretary at the time, was told to sell off his stocks before the crash.
So the book is portraying the crash as a deliberate scheme, a way for certain people to profit from the chaos.
Right. They create the boom and then profit from the bust. Then we jump into the years after World War II and the Bretton Woods Agreement. This is when a new global financial system was set up. The source suggests that international bankers had a long-term goal to control the world's money.
World domination through finance.
And the Bretton Woods system might have been a step towards that goal. The book introduces a bunch of organizations like the Royal Institute of International Affairs, or RIIA, and the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR. It calls them key players in the global financial game. And it mentions the Bilderberg Group and the Trilateral Commission as offshoots of these bigger organizations.
These groups are often seen as places where the elite meet to discuss and maybe even decide on global policies. It plays into that idea of a powerful hidden network working behind the scenes.
And the book names the heads of 4 institutions as the inner circle of central banking: the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, the U.S. Federal Reserve, the German Bundesbank, and the Bank of England. It specifically points out that the Bank of France wasn't part of this inner circle.
Interesting. The source is suggesting a hierarchy of influence within global monetary policy.
It also talks about the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. It claims they helped make the U.S. dollar the world's dominant currency. It even mentions Joseph Stiglitz and how he was fired from the World Bank because he disagreed with their globalization policies. It paints these institutions as tools for making the dollar the king.
The source is giving a very critical view of the IMF and the World Bank, suggesting that they're more interested in protecting the dollar's dominance than in helping developing countries.
Then the book lays out this 3-step process for getting rid of the gold standard. It claims that was the goal all along, to get to a system where money wasn't tied to gold anymore,
Giving central banks much more power to control the money supply.
Now the focus shifts to the rise of the petrodollar. The source claims the 1973 oil crisis wasn't an accident.
You think someone planned it?
The book says it was a deliberate strategy that came out of the 1973 Bilderberg meeting. It claims the goal was to save the U.S. dollar, which had been getting weaker after the Bretton Woods system fell apart. It even names David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski as being involved.
That's a big accusation.
And it goes on to explain how Henry Kissinger supposedly negotiated the petrodollar system. This is where Saudi Arabia agreed to only sell oil in U.S. dollars, which created a massive global demand for the dollar.
Clever is true.
That's how the source says the dollar maintained its position as the world's reserve currency. But the book doesn't stop there. The next section is called The Attack on Gold.
An attack on gold.
The source claims that even though the gold standard was officially over, international bankers were still worried about gold prices going up.
Because a high gold price would undermine faith in paper money.
Exactly. So the book describes this scheme called central bank gold leasing. Central banks would lend their gold to bullion bankers like J.P. Morgan, who would then sell that gold on the open market.
Driving the price down.
Right. Increasing the supply of gold would lower its price. And then on top of that, the book says bullion bankers were offering cheap loans to gold miners in exchange for the rights to buy their future gold production. These are called gold forward contracts,
So they're locking in future gold supplies at a low price.
which would help them keep gold prices under control. Now the source goes to the nature of fiat currency. It includes a quote from John Exter, a former VP of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Exter says fiat currency is bad because it's not backed by anything real and it doesn't provide a stable store of value for the public.
A strong critique of the system.
And then the book briefly mentions the Rothschild family's involvement in fixing gold prices historically, leading into a discussion of the London gold fix.
That was the mechanism for setting the global gold price for decades.
The source explains how the London gold fix was established in 1919 at Rothschild's bank, and it names the 5 firms that participated in setting the price. The source is highlighting the Rothschilds' continued power in the gold market.
Okay, so we've gone through centuries of financial history and a lot of controversial claims. How does this all end?
Well, the last section is called The Future of Currency. The source predicts that people will eventually go back to gold and silver,
Because they see those as safer than fiat currencies.
especially as fiat currencies keep losing value. The book even compares international bankers armed with financial tools to this vast sea of people's war. It also worries about the growing U.S. national debt and suggests a financial collapse might be coming. It's a pretty dark ending.
The source seems to be predicting a future where people reject the current financial system and go back to something more tangible like gold and silver.
So to summarize what we've learned from this source, it paints a picture of powerful financial families like the Rothschilds operating behind the scenes to control the global financial system.
They manipulate events, they orchestrate wars and crises, they establish central banks to their advantage.
And it claims that fiat currencies are inherently unstable and that the current system is unsustainable.
That's a lot to take in.
It is. And remember, this is just one perspective on these complex historical events. It's important to do your own research and consider different viewpoints. Don't just take the source's word for it.
Definitely. Think critically, read widely, and form your own conclusions.
This deep dive has explored the idea that controlling money equals controlling power. So here's something to ponder as you go about your day. In an increasingly interconnected world where finance plays a huge role, what does this mean for national sovereignty? And what role could alternative or decentralized financial systems play in the future?
Those are big questions.
Food for thought.
Absolutely.